This week, one-on-one with Kim Foxx, the Cook County State's Attorney defends her new policy on traffic stops. Schools, budgets, and bears. We get the rundown on what gets passed and what gets punted in Springfield. Mayor Johnson rebuked by City Council the future of ShotSpotter after Council votes to keep it. Welcome to Paris on Politics. I'm Paris Schutz, and each week we will bring the biggest political stories of the week to you, whether they come from the back rooms of City Hall or out on the street in the neighborhoods. And first tonight, should prosecutors lay off of gun or drug charges if they were discovered in routine traffic stops? It's a new plan proposed by the Cook County State's Attorney Kim Foxx, and I am pleased to have her join me right now. State's Attorney, good to see you here.
Thank you. Congrats on the new show.
I really appreciate it. So this proposal is not enacted yet, but you're proposing this 7 months before you leave office. Why while you're a lame duck prosecutor?
Because the issue isn't lame. This is an issue that has been studied for a number of years, that has caused a great deal of impact, particularly in Black and brown communities, so much so that even earlier this week, Superintendent Snelling has agreed to have traffic stops as part of the consent decree. And so the issue doesn't go away simply because I will be transitioning from this position. It is urgent, and the urgency is now.
And there was analysis done that showed that of about 450,000 of these traffic stops, less than 1% resulted in gun or drug charges, although that still is hundreds of potential felonies. Is that a concern?
You know, our number one concern is public safety, and this initiative is a part of a public safety strategy. First and foremost, people have to have trust and legitimacy in our law enforcement partners. And so the studies have shown that we have neighborhoods, particularly on the south and west sides, where these stops, we're stopping 6, 7, 8 times the same person. Blacks are 6 times more likely to be pulled over. And why does that matter to public safety? It is these neighborhoods that are impacted by violence that have the biggest struggles with trust and legitimacy in law enforcement, because they see things like this. And so we want to make sure that people who have guns and drugs that are harm to our community are dealt with. But we're talking about hundreds of thousands of people who have been impacted by these types of stops that we also have to care for.
And you mentioned this is going to be part of the consent decree now. They're going to look at these traffic stops. Does that mean CPD has sort of erred in the way that's conducted these over the last few years?
I think Superintendent Snelling has acknowledged that there is a need for reform, and part of that is looking at these stops. These stops have dropped over the course of the last year, but the truth of the matter is when the consent decree was formed years ago, the big concern was stop and frisk, and we saw a precipitous drop in stop and frisk and a dramatic rise in traffic stops. And so I think there's a recognition that we can't substitute one form of unconstitutional policing for another, and the recognition that trust with community requires that we look at this.
This got a lot of reaction. Some folks very critical. Alderman Silvana Tavares says that it would, quote, cement your reputation as the most pro-criminal prosecutor in the country. Your response to criticism like that?
You know, I certainly have respect for Alderman Tavares, but again, we are leading the country in reforms in the Cook County State's Attorney's Office, and I'm very proud of that. What Silvana Tavares, who sits on the City Council, has done over the course of the last several years have written checks related to unconstitutional policing. We have seen—
You're talking about the payouts that City Council has made.
Absolutely.
To victims.
To victims of unconstitutional policing for wrongful convictions. We have been called the false confession capital of the United States. I certainly know that she's not proud of that. What this is about is non-safety traffic stops. Non-safety traffic stops. We're not talking about
sort of
people—
a license plate issue, a sticker issue.
A sticker, a headlight, or a tail light issue. That's what we're talking about. And I should note that there are other jurisdictions across the country, whether we're talking about Michigan or Minnesota or Connecticut, who've done similar things. And again, while they're debating ShotSpotter, and I know you're going to talk about that later, the reason that ShotSpotter technology is even necessary is because there are some communities who are so reluctant to engage with policing that we now have technology to come in and step in. We need to address the issue that has so many communities disenfranchised, not keep creating new technology.
Well, let me ask you again, Alderman Tavares is criticizing you because in some of those stops, whether they're for stickers or whether they're for license, what she's saying is a judge can throw out a drug or a gun charge if it's the result of an unreasonable search. Sure. So the judge already has that power.
But what about the cases that don't come before us? Again, what we want to do is disincentivize the stop in the first place. If there are hundreds of thousands of these stops where there's nothing found, yes, I agree that good they're not in the courts, but the impact is the same. And in cases where someone walks upon a car, and we should be clear, police officers, if they find something in plain sight, the courts have been very clear. When you find something in plain sight, we can prosecute that. What we're talking about is a stop predicated on a broken tail light. That now I've stopped you and I'm now asking you to pop your trunk. I'm now asking you to open your glove box. Why are we asking you to
that's
open
an
that?
unreasonable search.
That is
an
an unreasonable.
Say the gun is in plain sight.
In plain sight, yes, we can prosecute and would prosecute those cases.
Okay, so that wouldn't be included in this order.
No, what we're talking about is stops that are made predicated on a non-safety issue that we are now seeking to search your vehicle as a result of that.
I see. The Republican candidate to take over your office, Bob Fioretti, who has a very difficult road if he wants to win this, has said he's going to do away with this on day one. We don't know where the Democratic candidate stands, although she's sounded a kind of tough on crime note in her campaign. Do you worry that your successor would just get rid of this policy when they took over?
You know, every elected official has a right to set their priorities and their agenda and prioritize where they want to use their resources. So it's not a worry of mine related to a predecessor. My worry is for the thousands of people who live in Black and brown neighborhoods who have been impacted by these stops, so much so that we're looking at it in the consent decree. This is not about politics, Paris. I am leaving. This is about the historical legacy that we have in these communities that feel as though law enforcement is not working with them but against them and trying to address that.
And so when do you plan to enact it? It's a proposal now, right?
Yeah, it's in its earliest phases, and part of what's happening is just this. We're having conversations with our partners in law enforcement. We're having conversations internally. We've been working on this since late winter, to be very clear. And so we've got things we want to hear, learn from before we roll it out. And so I don't have a timetable for you, but we believe that the urgency of the matter requires us to work on it now.
I want to ask you again about some of your successors, because both of them are going to go back on your retail theft policy. Stolen goods over $300 they would charge as a felony. You charge as a misdemeanor up to $1,000. Is that a mistake to go back on that?
I certainly would remind my successors, whoever it is, that Illinois sits as an outlier. That when we look at places like Texas, whose felony threshold is $2,500, or Minnesota, it's $2,000, and we talk about the violence that we see in our communities, no other state that has a much higher threshold has the same issues in urban violence like we do in Chicago. And so I certainly would hope that my successors care about violent crime in our cities and are not doing things that make us an outlier. 48 other states have a much higher threshold for retail theft than we do in Illinois. But I can tell you no other city in those states have had as many homicides as we've had in the city of Chicago.
So you're saying there's really no correlation between higher crime and that lower threshold for charging a felony for shoplifting?
Absolutely not. In fact, there's data and research. The Pew Institute did a study years ago that looked at whether there was a correlation between higher thresholds and higher crime. It never has been. And what's been interesting over the course of the last 7 years as we've had this conversation, there's been no data to support it, ever.
Speaking of data, you mentioned ShotSpotter. City Council took that vote rebuking the mayor. It's kind of unclear what that means for ShotSpotter. Is it an effective tool or no?
You know, it's not my job to evaluate the effectiveness of the tool. We did look in the state's attorney's office to see if it helped us improve our prosecutions of gun crimes or violent crime, and our analysis of ShotSpotter demonstrated that it did not. Now, I certainly recognize that we should have every tool in our tool belt to address violent crime in our communities, but we also have a responsibility, especially as elected officials, to ensure the efficacy of the tools that we're using. You're talking tens of millions of dollars to deliver on a promise of safety. Is it doing what it says it's going to do? I think that's the question.
You know, I don't know if I'm going to interview you before you leave office. Hopefully I do, but I got to ask you the bigger question. You know, you've taken a lot of criticism from the former mayor, the former police superintendent, from folks right of center in your two terms in office. I mean, you came in with a promise to do what you've done. How do you react to the criticism? Like we mentioned earlier, you know, being called pro-criminal.
I react to the criticism with the fact that I look in the faces of some of the hundreds of men and women who were wrongfully convicted, who have a new lease on life. I look at the fact that we have vacated tens of thousands of convictions for people for marijuana use now that it's legalized. I look at the fact that we lead the country over the last 5 or 6 years in the vacating of wrongful convictions. I look at our office and the fact that we have prosecuted the killers of Ella French, Paul Bauer, Tyshawn Lee, Hadia Pendleton.
Right. The first few you mentioned, police officers.
Police officers. I look at that record.
Is the city safer?
I think the city is on track to be safer. And I also remind people, the first 3 years of my tenure at Paris, crime went down year over year. And so I think it's interesting that we elevate the voices of the critics, and they certainly are part of the conversation. But this office and this state, quite honestly, in the abolition of cash bail, which I will remind you, even some of those critics were saying that the world would fall apart, and it hasn't. And we lead the nation in the abolition of cash bail. So I'm really proud of my tenure, very proud of the work that we've been able to do, and certainly believe that the efforts to reinvigorate legitimacy and credibility in this office with the communities we serve, we've made a lot of progress there.
All right, State's Attorney Kim Foxx, good to see you. Thanks for joining us here.
Of course, thank you, Paris.
Chicago Mayor Brandon Johnson is demanding $1 billion more from state lawmakers for CPS. The Bears are demanding at least twice that for a new stadium on the lakefront. Meanwhile, the state has to pay its own bills and has about a few more hours to make decisions on all of those things. So for the latest on what passes and what gets punted in Springfield, we are joined by Sun-Times political reporter Tina Sfondelis from the press room there at the state capitol. Tina, good to see you. So Pritzker has said the state needs $800 million in new revenue to balance the state budget. Where is that revenue going to come from?
This is the proposal that he had in his budget speech earlier this year. It's about $200 million from sports gambling. There has been some dissent on that, but it looks like it's probably going to happen. There's a retailer's cap. It's a sales tax that retailers have. And then there's like a gigantic corporate tax. It does look like these are being negotiated. It does look like they're all going to go through. They've been changed, but basically the crux of his package looks to be going through.
So it sounds like Democratic lawmakers, there won't be a whole lot of controversy on what the governor's proposed. Some controversy of what Mayor Johnson's demanding, $1 billion more for CPS. I think we can safely say $1 billion is not going to be coming from Springfield. Will CPS see any more money in the state budget?
Well, we don't have the final budget numbers yet. It's still being drafted, but I do believe that they will not be getting extra money. They were in Springfield a couple weeks ago to demand extra funding. There just isn't money for it. They will be getting the amounts allotted in the school funding formula. Definitely not getting that extra.
And that's going to disappoint the mayor and the Chicago Teachers Union organizers who went down there, as you mentioned last week. And the CPS does have a $400 million budget gap that they're going to have to close. We reported today on a bill about CPS selective enrollment schools, protecting them from closures and funding cuts. It looks like that bill's not going to be voted on, does it?
I don't believe it will be. The House was really excited because when it passed and it looked like it had approval in the Senate and the governor said he would sign it. But Mayor Brandon Johnson wrote a letter to Senate President Don Harmon yesterday saying that he vowed that he will do the things that are in the bill, that he will not be closing any schools before an elected school board is in. And not make any of these major changes that people are scared about. So now we have Brandon Johnson's word that he will not do these things. And if he doesn't, there's a bill in place that lawmakers can try to pass in the veto session.
Oh, I see. Okay. So kind of a game of chicken here between the mayor and lawmakers. The Bears, nothing's happening on that, is it? Safe to say?
No, absolutely nothing happening on that right now.
There's a lot more things on lawmakers' minds. Other interesting pieces of legislation you're following, Tina, that we haven't heard much about?
I just have a quirky one that I'm interested in personally is the O'Hare ticket one, because I'm just a nerd rule follower and I park when I have to pick people up, but people are always hovering on the lanes. So this is a new law. Pritzker has not yet signed it, but it's passed in the House and Senate, and you'll get a $100 ticket if you are one of those people loitering off of within a mile radius of O'Hare trying to pick someone up without being in the proper area.
Within a mile of O'Hare, okay. So not if you're just like right outside the exit?
Radius. And also, you know, on the interstate, on the highway, when you're getting off at O'Hare, there's people who just kind of pull over on the expressway. Those you would also get a ticket there too.
All right, get prepared, motorists and air travelers. The tickets are coming. Tina Sfondelis, live from Springfield. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, Paris.
A very rare occurrence at City Hall. The mayor was roundly defeated in a vote by his city council. It's a political blow to Johnson, who campaigned on doing away with the controversial ShotSpotter technology. But this week, a majority of Alder people rebuked him and signaled they want to keep it turned on.
This particular measure that was voted on today did nothing. This city council, the legislative body, does not have executive authority.
Mayor Johnson defiant after proponents of ShotSpotter passed legislation that sets the stage for the technology to stick around. This despite the mayor's deal to keep the system through the Democratic National Convention.
The fact of the matter is that this tool has been proven to be ineffective. I canceled ShotSpotter. It's canceled.
Sound Thinking, the company behind ShotSpotter, engaged in a furious lobbying campaign, getting more centrist council members to back the order. It led to an impassioned council meeting today. A mass shooting in Alderman Monique Scott's 24th ward has her afraid of losing ShotSpotter.
This is something my community needs. There were 90 shots, 6 shooters. 90 shots, 6 shooters. Not one person called the police. So this is safe for the DNC, but not for my constituents.
The final vote came after efforts from Johnson allies to use parliamentary tricks to punt to a future date, efforts that ultimately failed.
And joining us now is Ralph Clark, CEO of Sound Thinking, the company behind ShotSpotter. Ralph Clark, thanks for joining us. City Council members passed this by a 34-14 margin. What do you make of this vote on Wednesday and such a high margin against the mayor and in favor of ShotSpotter?
Well, we're incredibly grateful for the support that we're getting, not only from residents, but also their elected officials that are confirming the idea that ShotSpotter works and it has value. And that's very consistent, I think, with the previous statements from the superintendent of Chicago PD as well. So we're grateful for that.
And the mayor says the ordinance doesn't do anything in effect because he has the executive authority to end the contract or phase it out like he did. Is that how you see it?
Yeah, so I don't know that I'm qualified to speak on the legality of this. Again, I think we're incredibly supportive or incredibly grateful around the support that we're getting. And it really doesn't change very much for us. I mean, we're going to continue to do the work that we've been doing since 2016 in supporting Chicago PD to be able to respond to incidents of gun crime, which we know is chronically underreported in some of our most at-risk vulnerable communities.
Well, we mentioned the deal that the mayor struck with your company to phase this out somewhere around the end of November. Is it your understanding then or your expectation that given this vote, ShotSpotter is going to stay on beyond that?
Yeah, so for right now, we're contracted through the DNC plus another 2 months. I think that puts us out through the end or through the middle of November. So we're not going to be distracted around the kind of politics and legal debates around this. We're going to be focused on our day-to-day work. We're incredibly happy about the idea of bringing more data to the discussion. So that's an area that we're going to clearly be redoubling our efforts in around helping CPD as much as we can and as much as appropriate around making sure that they're bringing data to this discussion so that folks can make better informed decisions about how to go forward.
And that data collection was a part of this ordinance that Alderman touted. You know, the Inspector General here in Chicago has said that supporters of this have moved the goalposts. ShotSpotter was originally sold as a way to solve gun crimes, but now the purpose is more about getting police and first responders to victims quicker. Is that the primary purpose here?
Yeah, I think we've also been very clear that communities are safer when police departments are equipped and responsible for responding to incidents of gun crime. Anyone that debates the alternative of that is not very serious about public safety. You can't argue that communities are safer when police aren't able to respond to incidents of gun crime, and that's what it's always been about for us.
And the Inspector General, her analysis found that 1 in 10 ShotSpotter alerts led police to evidence of a gun crime. Is that the way you see it?
Yeah, I think we should put an adjective on that and say what she really means is there's no physical evidence of gun crime, but in fact there is plenty of digital evidence. I think what most people don't understand is that we're actually preserving the digital evidence of gun crime being committed by the recording snippet that goes along with the alert that we send over to police. And I think we should also spend a lot more time around understanding kind of what's in that 10 to 15% of the time when police officers are getting there along with first responders to incidents of gun crime, you're literally finding gunshot wound victims, you're recovering shell casings. Sometimes you're able to take specific crime guns off the street and sometimes actually even arrest offenders.
You're saying you don't want to get into the politics or the legality, but City Council clearly has momentum. ShotSpotter clearly has momentum. The mayor sees it a different way. Do you think that ShotSpotter is willing to go to court if City Council passes further legislation that says, no, we want to keep this turned on past this phase-out agreement?
Look, so I think we should listen to the people that are closest to the problem. I think we should listen to residents. I think we should listen to Chicago PD, who is trying to serve and protect the residents of Chicago. I think we should listen to the elected officials that are clearly listening to the residents. They're saying two things. One, we find this technology, it works. And two, we find it incredibly valuable. That's who we should be listening to. And really take the politics out of this and focus on public safety versus politics.
All right, Ralph Clark, CEO of Sound Thinking, the creator of ShotSpotter. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me.
Before we go tonight, it's time to predict the big stories I'll be watching for in the week ahead. First, the Trump hush money Stormy Daniels trial. The case goes to jury next week. Could Trump be convicted? And the Supreme Court, could they decide on his immunity case? Also, the first major test for new Superintendent Larry Snelling on what is traditionally a violent weekend. We'll see how CPD handled crime over Memorial Day. And security preparations for the Democratic National Convention. We're going to learn more about how the Secret Service plans to keep conventioneers and residents safe when they all descend on Chicago in late August. But for now, enjoy your holiday weekend. Stay up to date on all the news you need with Fox Chicago on air and online. So long, everyone.